He burned it. Right there in front of everyone, my father took the inheritance document my grandfather left me, flicked open his gold-plated lighter, and set it on fire like it was junk mail. "You don't deserve it," he said loud enough for the entire room to hear. Disappearing for 5 years, then crawling back like some stray dog. "You're not family anymore." The flames curled up the edges of the paper like a slow smile. $38 million gone in smoke. And no one, not even my sister, said a word. I remember standing there frozen. The same girl they once called a hero when I wore my uniform now treated like a parasite. I'd just flown back from Afghanistan. My hands still smelled like sand and gun oil. But in my father's eyes, I was dirt. He threw the lighter onto the marble floor and walked away. Just like that. They all followed him, my sister, her fiancé, even the family lawyer. All except one person. I stood alone. Until I remembered something. A letter. A sealed envelope my grandfather gave me the day I turned 18. He told me, "Don't open this unless they try to erase you." So I opened it. And what I found inside, let's just say when they tried to bury me, they didn't know I'd been sitting on a bombshell all along. They burned the wrong document. And I was the only one in that room who knew it. My name is Rachel Bennett. I came home in uniform, but they welcomed me with fire. Before I share the full story with you, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple hi in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the truth only lives on if someone listens. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. I stepped into the Lawson & Pierce law office 5 minutes before the will reading began. The air inside felt colder than it should have been, like the temperature dropped just for me. Everyone turned. No one said a word. My father's glare landed on me, first sharp, cold, surgical. Like I was some stain he'd scrubbed off long ago and couldn't believe had returned. My sister Claire offered a faint smirk, her arms crossed like she'd been preparing for the showdown since birth. She didn't even stand up. Margaret Lawson, the family attorney, gestured toward the last empty seat across the table. Her face was expressionless, but her hands kept fidgeting with her glasses. Even she looked like she didn't want me here. It had been 5 years. 5 years since I'd left San Francisco to serve overseas. I didn't come back for Christmas, didn't call on birthdays, not that anyone called me either. But when Grandpa Henry passed, I came back for one reason, because I promised him I would. He used to say, "Rachel, I don't care what happens between you and the others. Just promise me you'll show up when the time comes." So I showed up. The will was long, full of legal terms that felt heavy in the room. Claire was granted the Napa Valley estate and the family piano. My father received a collection of rare books and a donation of $10,000 to the museum he chaired. Everyone nodded. Everything was going as expected, until it wasn't. And to my granddaughter, Rachel Ann Bennett, Margaret read, "I leave full controlling interest in Bennett Innovations and all documentation pertaining to the company's succession, including but not limited to a trust totaling $38 million. Silence. My father's hand twitched. Claire's jaw clenched. Before Margaret could finish the paragraph, my father stood, reached across the table, and snatched the folder out of her hands. No hesitation. He walked to the fireplace in the corner of the conference room, ornamental, barely ever used, and lit the entire packet on fire with his engraved lighter. "You don't deserve any of it," he said, turning toward me as the flames reflected in his eyes. "You walked away from this family. You don't get to come crawling back and claim what isn't yours." Smoke rose in the room. The smell of burnt paper filled my lungs. Claire didn't move. Neither did Margaret. The entire room had gone still, like this was rehearsed, and I was the only one who missed the script. But me, I didn't cry. I didn't protest. I didn't even flinch. I smiled. Because deep in my coat pocket was a sealed envelope. One my grandfather gave me when I turned 18. He'd said, "Don't open it unless they try to erase you." I glanced around the room, and in the far corner I saw Laura Mitchell, my father's second wife. She hadn't said a word the whole time. She wasn't glaring like the others. She was quiet. Her eyes flicked back and forth, almost like she was watching a train wreck she'd helped set in motion. There was something about her stillness, the way she clutched her purse tighter every time someone raised their voice. It didn't sit right. My grandfather used to say, "Watch the ones who stay quiet when the fire starts." Now I knew what he meant. And as the last ashes of the $38 million inheritance drifted up the chimney, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back in my tiny apartment in Oakland, I opened the envelope. My hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline. Inside was a neatly folded letter, a flash drive, and a notarized trust document. There was also a small card with an address and a key taped to the back. The trust was real, the assets real. The document my father had burned, just a copy. My grandfather had anticipated this. I could practically hear his voice in my head, calm and sharp as ever. "They'll try to take everything. That's why I left you the real sword." But legal language wasn't my battlefield. I needed help. So I called Alex Turner, a former JAG officer I served with in Kandahar. He owed me a favor. Within hours, he was in my living room scanning the documents. "Rachel," he said, after 30 minutes of reading, "this isn't just valid, it's airtight. Henry transferred the assets to you before his death. You're the legal owner of Bennett Innovations. And if they destroyed the copy in front of witnesses, that actually helps you." We laughed briefly. Then I told him I'd tried logging into the trust's bank portal, but the account was flagged inactive, deceased. I thought it was a glitch. It wasn't. According to the system, Rachel Ann Bennett had been declared legally dead in San Francisco 3 months before Grandpa died. That's when the weight dropped. We went straight to the Department of Vital Records. I showed them my military ID, my passport, even my discharge papers. The clerk frowned and said, "There's a death certificate filed under your name. You'll need a court order to challenge it. Could take a few months." The name on the certificate signed by Dr. Evelyn Carter. She'd once been our family doctor. That made it worse. It wasn't just a system error. Someone close had helped make it real. I drove home in silence, key in hand, the one my grandfather gave me at 18. The address led me to a private security vault facility in Oakland Pacific Security Vaults. When I arrived, I presented my ID. They hesitated. The system still marked me as deceased. The guard looked apologetic. I reached into my folder and pulled out my deployment orders, then my discharge summary. "I came back in one piece," I said. "Doesn't that make me alive enough?" It worked. They led me to a vault in the back. Inside, in perfect order, were documents, a video drive, and a handwritten journal from my grandfather. The flash drive held contracts, financials, emails, proof that he'd predicted every move my father might try to make. He had set the foundation for a full legal recovery. As I stepped out of the building, I spotted someone across the street. A woman wearing a green silk scarf, my mother's scarf. It was Laura Mitchell. She looked at me for a full second. No words. Just eyes locked hers wide with fear or guilt, or maybe both. Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about my father hating me. It wasn't just a power play. This had been planned, piece by piece, step by step. And more than one person had played a part in trying to erase me. But what they didn't know was this. They hadn't buried me. They'd only made me harder to kill. And now I had the proof. and a war they couldn't burn away. I asked Alex to reach out to Jessica Harper, a former military attorney I'd once trusted in Kandahar, when my unit was being falsely accused of a misconduct report. She hadn't changed. Sharp, unshakable, and quicker with a legal clause than most generals are with orders. The moment she saw the documents, she agreed to take the case. That same day, she filed a motion with the court to freeze all transactions related to Bennett Innovations until ownership could be verified. We brought in Ethan Brooks, a forensic document specialist I'd worked with briefly during a joint base audit. Ethan took one look at the renunciation of inheritance letter my father had waved around at the press and frowned. He ran a digital overlay analysis and confirmed what I'd suspected it was my signature, but lifted from a classified field report from Afghanistan. A place no one outside the military should have ever accessed. That meant someone had gone deep. Too deep. Ethan dug further and traced the chain of metadata embedded in the signature image. The file originated from a restricted access military database. Someone with clearance had leaked it, someone wearing a uniform. I was summoned to an internal military review panel. It was surreal being forced to prove I was alive to the very institution I'd served for years. I had to verify my own identity with a mountain of deployment logs, biometric scans, and footage from a forward operating base in Helmand Province. They believed me eventually, but the process stripped something inside me. It wasn't just the family denying my existence anymore, it was the machine I'd bled for. While I was in those hearings, my father held a press conference in front of Bennett Innovations headquarters. The cameras rolled as he read from a thick file, one he claimed came from military archives. In it were pages of distorted behavioral assessments, disciplinary warnings, and notations that painted me as unstable, violent, and mentally unfit. He didn't stop there. He went as far as calling me a dangerous woman hiding behind medals. The media loved it. So did the investors. My phone buzzed nonstop for hours. Messages from colleagues, friends, old instructors, some supportive, some confused, all asking, "Is this true?" I had seen those exact pages before. They weren't part of my record, but they were close, too close. It was then that Ethan confirmed what I feared: the pages had been constructed using real formatting and headers from a legitimate base, but the content had been spliced and reworded. Someone had paid for a forgery detailed enough to pass casual scrutiny. Ethan identified one source, a retired lieutenant colonel with a past linked to Edwards' business consulting firm. We reached out to Nathan Reed, an investigative journalist I'd followed for years. He'd exposed corruption in a Senate election once and never backed down from messy stories. He agreed to cover mine on one condition: hard proof. I gave him the flash drive my grandfather left me. Inside was the video. My grandfather sat at his desk, glasses off, voice steady. He looked directly into the camera and said, "If Rachel is hearing this, it means the worst has happened. Let it be known that she is the intended heir to Bennett Innovations. Not Edward, not Claire, only her." Nathan's article dropped the next morning. The video exploded across every platform. People started talking. Old colleagues from my unit commented beneath the story. Strangers emailed. A few called me a fraud, but more began to question my father's story. And yet, despite the shift in public opinion, the banks still flagged me as deceased. My passport renewal was denied. My credit score dropped to 0. Legally, I was still a ghost. I could feel the weight of it tightening around me. To be alive in body but dead on paper, it broke something I hadn't known could break. A week after the article, an anonymous email landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "They're using your name, no greeting, no signature. Just a scanned invoice totaling $647,320 billed to a vendor in Dubai." The signature authorizing the expense was mine, but I'd never seen that paper before in my life. Attached was a second file, A copy of the internal ledger from Bennett Innovations showing Claire had signed under my name using my old internal ID number. The fraud wasn't subtle. It was bold, reckless, almost as if they believed I'd never resurface. I called Laura Mitchell. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why she had worn my mother's scarf, why she had stayed silent at the will reading, and what she was doing in the middle of all this. She was reluctant, cagey, but finally, in a low, tired voice, she admitted it. She had helped Edward file the death certificate. She'd been the one to deliver the forged documents to Dr. Evelyn Carter. When I asked why she didn't answer at first, then she said it was for her son, her child from a previous marriage. Edward had threatened to cut off any inheritance the boy might receive if she didn't cooperate. But there was something else in her voice, something not entirely forced. Regret, perhaps. Or guilt layered with resentment. Something personal. I found Dr. Carter 2 days later. She'd retired but still lived in the city. I showed up at her doorstep unannounced. She recognized me immediately. Her hands trembled as she opened the door wider. I didn't want to believe it, she said. But he showed me medical notes, charts, things that made you look dangerous. We sat down in her living room and I told her everything. By the end, she was in tears. She admitted Edward had manipulated her, pressured her with doctored files, and used their long friendship to gain her trust. She opened a drawer and handed me a fax, a record from a military psychiatric office, but one where the signature line had been whited out and retyped. The original had a faint imprint underneath. The signature had been altered and poorly. I scanned it, heart pounding. It was the evidence we needed to prove Edward had faked my psychiatric status. I drove home feeling numb. It wasn't just legal manipulation anymore. It was psychological warfare. They hadn't only tried to cut me out, they'd weaponized my past, my service, my trauma. My own family had built a version of me they could control. One that looked unstable enough to be erased without question. I parked in front of Bennett Innovations and stared at the company logo for a long time. The same company I used to be proud of. The same name I once carried with pride. If Grandpa knew what had become of it all, if he saw the smear campaigns, the lies, the falsified death certificates, would he still believe I was strong enough to walk this road? I thought of the video again. His voice, his conviction. When they burn your name, he said, let the truth be what sets their world on fire. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just reclaiming a company. I was reclaiming the version of myself they tried to destroy. I launched the Bennett Foundation in a modest office on 17th and Broadway in Oakland. The mission was clear: support women veterans like me, women who came home from war only to face silence. I hired 3 staffers, 2 of whom had served in Kabul. At the same time, I reopened Greaves Forward in San Francisco. The space was smaller than before, but it had new purpose. We focused on legal counseling, career transitions, and trauma recovery. It felt like I was finally building something that mattered. For a while, everything moved forward. Veterans reached out. Community partners offered help. Then the whispers started. At first, it was online. Posts questioning whether I had faked my service record to claim inheritance. Then came the darker rumors that I'd been dishonorably discharged, that I'd forged documents to take over Bennett Innovations. I brought it to Ethan. He traced the post's IP addresses. What we found led to a PR firm called Shadow Arc. Their specialty was crisis management and digital reputation targeting. Their client, Claire Bennett. I emailed Claire. I asked her straight, Why turn your own sister into a public villain? She never replied. A week later, a manila envelope arrived at my foundation's mailbox. Inside was a copy of my military journal from Ghazni, pages detailing the days after the ambush, my panic attacks, the smell of burning skin that wouldn't leave my clothes. Pages I had written in private for myself. Someone had leaked them. I sat at my desk for hours staring at those pages. They weren't damning in any official way, but they painted me in the rawest light: wounded, afraid, broken, the kind of image that could be manipulated in the public eye. The next morning, one of our key donors pulled out. The official statement cited a pause to reevaluate transparency. But I knew. The smear campaign was working. On Monday, I arrived at Greaves Forward to find shattered glass across the sidewalk. The front door had been smashed. Inside, filing cabinets were overturned, desks gutted, no electronics were stolen, nothing of material value. But spray painted across the far wall in black was a single phrase: liar. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stood there, feeling the floor tilt beneath me, the noise of cobble returning to my ears, alarm's dirt screaming the thud of boots. My hands shook. My lungs collapsed inward. But I didn't fall. Later that day, a single typed letter appeared in my office locker. Walk away, Rachel. Before you can't. I didn't tell the team. I didn't want to seed fear. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense that someone close, someone with access, was watching from the inside. I contacted Laura Mitchell and demanded a meeting. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe near Presidio Park. She ordered tea as if nothing had happened. I asked her why. Why help destroy me? She said it was for her son. Edward had threatened to remove him from the family will. But then she looked at me and said without blinking, "I used to think your mother didn't deserve Henry. And now I think the same about you." Her voice didn't shake. It was calm, rehearsed. I pressed further. That's when she admitted it. Her resentment had never left. That scarf she wore outside the vault. It wasn't nostalgia. It was possession. Henry had loved my mother once deeply. Laura had spent years trying to scrub that memory from the family history. Helping Edward erase me was just another page in her revision. That night, I returned to the vandalized office. I stood in the center of the wreckage, paper-torn, memories scattered, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. A soldier, a fraud, a daughter who believed too long in promises from the dead. I opened the video one more time. My grandfather looked straight into the lens. "If you ever feel like no one stands with you, it's because you're already out front. Keep walking." I wasn't sure I could, but I knew I had to. Jessica filed the lawsuit against Edward: defamation, property destruction, and document falsification. Ethan compiled the data trail that connected the Shadow Arc campaign to multiple offshore shell companies. The paper trail led directly to a holding firm in Nevada, one of Edward's. Nathan Reed picked up the trail and published the findings in a multi-part exposé. But the reaction wasn't what we expected. The post didn't trend. The video barely circulated. Ethan began to suspect manipulation. He followed the server traffic and uncovered a network of dummy accounts, all posting praise for Edward, all drowning out the story. Someone had been investing for years in false narratives. Truth was being buried faster than we could dig. That week, I hosted a town hall at the Bennett Foundation. We invited every woman we'd helped to speak to take the microphone and share what the foundation meant to them. One by one, they stood. A former paratrooper, a combat medic, a logistics officer who had lost her home after discharge. I stood last, and I told them what no one had heard before. I said it plainly, voice raw: I have PTSD. I've fought panic. I've screamed in silence. I've been called a ghost by the people who should have protected me, and I'm still standing. After the event, Claire waited for me by the fountain in Dolores Park. No entourage, no handlers, just her arms folded. She looked older than I remembered. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said. "But I know I helped turn you into someone you're not. And I'm sorry." She handed me a hard drive. On it were dozens of emails, communications between Edward and Laura, plans, language about Shadow Ark's tactics, quotes from my journal mixed with suggested headlines. It was all there. Evidence that I wasn't just attacked. I was engineered to be discredited. We submitted the drive to the court. The hearing date was confirmed. For the first time, the system had to look my father in the face and hear who I was. The night before the trial, I got a call from San Francisco PD. There had been a break-in at Greaves Forward. Nothing stolen. But someone had plugged a flash drive into our server. Every client record was gone, erased. Hours later, Laura Mitchell was detained at the border. She'd been trying to leave the state. In her initial statement, she confessed, not just to the vandalism but to the scheme. She said Edward planned it all. She said she was scared of what he might do next. Her confession changed everything. The press took notice. The judge requested a review. Witnesses were subpoenaed. The momentum shifted. I sat in my apartment that night and looked around. There were no medals on the walls, no photographs of my service, just notes folders and a quiet. I remembered what it felt like to have your name burned in front of you. But I'd learned something since that day. The only thing more terrifying than being forgotten is never fighting to be remembered. And I wasn't done fighting yet. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Marble walls, high ceilings, and the echo of each step made everything feel heavier. I sat on the left side of the room across from Edward. This was the first time in years I could look him in the eye without feeling like I was about to break. He didn't look angry. He looked confident, rehearsed as if this too was a performance he'd already staged in his head. Jessica sat beside me, her briefcase brimming with evidence. Contracts from Shadow Ark, financial transfers, the testimony from Laura, the hard drive Claire handed over. She laid it all out with the precision of a surgeon. When Claire entered the courtroom, she looked pale, but her spine was straight. She took the witness stand, raised her right hand, and spoke in a voice I hadn't heard in years, one that wasn't trying to win or please. Just confess. She said Edward manipulated her, that he threatened to revoke her stake in the company if she didn't comply. She admitted to signing off on invoices in my name, admitted she watched him launch a smear campaign against me. And then she said something I never expected. I let jealousy guide me. I thought taking her down would bring me closer to him. Instead, I lost myself. The opposing counsel called a rebuttal witness a psychologist. He claimed I had delusions of persecution, that I had constructed a fantasy of betrayal to justify my actions. But Jessica was ready. She stood, handed the judge a file, and asked the witness a single question. Can you confirm your employment history includes work for PR firms under the Bennett Group? He faltered. Within minutes, she'd demonstrated he'd been paid by Edward before. Not just once. Multiple times. His testimony unraveled in front of everyone. The judge called for a 30-minute recess. When she returned, her voice was calm but firm. This court does not only see a family dispute, it sees a coordinated effort to erase the legal and personal identity of a citizen, a veteran, a daughter. She ordered the full restoration of my legal status in the state of California. Every falsified document was nullified. My ownership of the humanitarian arm of Bennett Innovations was reinstated along with the full operating fund that my grandfather had endowed. Edward's assets were frozen pending a full criminal investigation. I could have fought for control of the whole company, but I didn't. I didn't want to wear a title that meant nothing to me. I wanted to lead something that did. I left the courthouse not as a victor, but as someone who had survived a fire no one else saw burning. I hadn't destroyed Edward. I hadn't become him. And that alone was the win I needed. I threw myself into rebuilding Greaves Forward. The windows were replaced, the walls repainted. What we lacked in space, we made up for in soul. Women showed up every day, some looking for work, some for legal advice, some just needing someone to sit beside them and not flinch when they talked about war. The video from the courtroom circulated. Nathan's articles were cited in national media. Donations began to come in. Then someone launched a campaign on my behalf. Rebuild with Rachel. I didn't even know who started it, but within 3 weeks it had raised over $500,000. The call came from the National Veterans Council. A year ago, they'd quietly pulled funding from my foundation without explanation. Now they not only reinstated their support, they asked me to be the keynote speaker at their Washington, D.C. conference. We used the funds to open a new wing at Greaves Forward, one dedicated to legal and psychological services. It was the same space that had once been trashed, its walls defaced. Now it had a name engraved at the entrance. Henry's Legacy. I watched women walk into that space every day, women who once believed they didn't have the right to ask for help. And I remembered who I was doing this for. Not for justice, not for closure, but for them and for me. One afternoon in a quiet hospital hallway, I ran into Laura. She was thinner, slower. Her son was being treated for a blood condition. She didn't try to make small talk. She just said, "I lost myself a long time ago, the moment I started resenting your mother." She paused. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." I didn't say anything. I reached into my bag, pulled out the green silk scarf that once belonged to my mother, and handed it to her. Then I walked away. Not out of cruelty, but because I no longer lived in the shadows she came from. Later that week, I returned to the vault where it all began. Inside a forgotten drawer was a small envelope. My grandfather's handwriting scrawled across the front. I opened it with careful hands. It was a single-page letter, written in blue ink. "Rachel, if you're reading this, you already won. Not because a court sided with you, but because you never let their darkness become yours. You are the fire that never goes out." I stood in front of our new office sign the next morning and read it out loud. Henry's Legacy, a place for veterans to begin again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was alone. I had a team, a purpose, a name that no one could take. They tried to burn me down like a worthless piece of paper, but I turned the ashes into fire, and I lit the way for everyone else they tried to forget. Because this is my family now. Some fires don't destroy, they reveal. In a world that often tries to silence the wounded, there is power in choosing to stand, to speak, to build again. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't revenge or recognition, but simply remembering who you are when others try to erase you. If this story moved you in any way, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, let me know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe. Your voice helps stories like this keep burning bright. Thank you.